Hello, in episode 10 of History of India, we are dealing with ancient and medieval Indian history. We have come to this part of post Vedic period. This starts from 600 BC because later Vedic period ends with 600 BC. So, the literature of post Vedic literature, the literature of this period is called Smriti literature. The meaning of Smriti is memorized literature. The period of the literature during Vedic period is called Shruti period, Shruti literature texts period. So, because this was given or this was heard by people and it was not made by people, and it was believed that these Shruti texts are revealed by gods, but this Smriti literature is not revealed by gods. So, Shruti has got more importance in this way than Smriti literature of post Vedic period. So they do not enjoy the sanctity that are given to Vedas, that is Shruti literature, but they have their own importance, or they are authoritative in their own right. So we shall see this Smriti literature of post-Vedic period under the following headings. The first one is Vedangas. Vedangas, they refer to some branches of post-Vedic studies, and we can consider them as auxiliaries to Vedas. So Vedangas are in under two headings. We have to read them. So the first one is Kaipa. Kaipa are also called Dharma Shastras. They include Dharma Shastras or Dharma Sutras. The meaning of Dharma comes from the word Dri. Dri means to maintain or to support. So this is what forms Vedanga, the first part of Vedanga, that is Kaipa. These Dharmashastras refer to natural and moral laws that govern universe and lives of people. So we know they speak of natural and moral laws by which we are following, by which we are living. So all of this is in Dharmashastras of Kaipa. These Dharmashastras, we can say they are social legal texts. They are legally binding, and they are framing the societal moral things and all of Indian society. So these are social legal texts, but they are divided into two broad phases, because the first part of Dharma Shastras was written during 500 to 200 BC, and the second part was written during 200 to 900 AD, 200 BC to 900 AD. So as they are written in two different phases, they are broadly divided into two types. The Dharma Shastras that are written in the first phase are Baudhayana Dharma Shastra, Gautama Dharma Shastra, and Apastamba Dharma Shastra. The Dharma Shastras written later from 200 BC to 900 AD are Manusmriti, Narada Smriti, and Yajna Valkya Smriti. So these Smritis are written in a later part of Dharma Shastra literature, and Baudhyana, Gautama, and Apastamba are written in the early part of Dharma Shastra literature. So we can say that post-Vedic literature extended even to 900 AD or 900 CE. The Dharma Shastras furnish about the founding principles of present Brahminical social system, and the system included Chaturvarna Shrama Dharma, and the system of Jatis, hierarchy, the sections we have seen in earlier Vedic period. All of that takes the base of these Dharma Shastras, or all of that is written again in Dharma Shastras. And this also speaks about some concepts of purity, pollution. So this is something regarding untouchability. And rituals, sacraments of Brahmanical system, everything is all written in these Dharma Shastras. And they have also laws of inheritance. So inheritance of kingship to the eldest son, things like that. And they have also certain things about marriage written in them. So Dharma Shastras have got the whole social system framework of ancient Indian history written in them. The other Vedangas are Jyotishya, which deals with astronomy, and Siksha, which deals with phonetics, the pronunciation of words. Chanda, the meter of prose, the meter of poetry, how many syllables a verse in a poetry must have. So all of that is Chanda. Virukta, or etymology, that deals with the origin of words, and Vyakarana, or grammar, so grammar of Sanskrit. So all of these make up Bhashika of Vedanga. Bhashika means philosophy. So this is about Vedanga. The second post-Vedic texts are Shad Darshanas. Shad means six. So there are six schools, orthodox schools of Hindu philosophy. So these Shad Darshanas are namely Nyaya, Vaiseshika, Sankhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta. We have seen again all of these in the Vedic literature in the starting introduction part of Vedic literature video. So this deals with Nyaya, deals with justice, and Mimamsa is about thought, investigation, and Vedanta, yoga, is some relation between mind, soul, and body. Itihasas are also written in post-Vedic period. They are called narratives. They narrate some stories. They have legendary and semi-legendary works inside them. So basically, specifically, they are Ramayana and Mahabharata, regarded as Itihasas in ancient Indian history. So we have them in post-Vedic literature. So specifically they would include Ramayana and Mahabharata. And all of these also extend into Puranas. Puranas include of Indian ancient history include Bhagavatam. So Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavatam, you call all of this as post-Vedic literature. So Purana is a later compilation. It was compiled later compared to Mahabharata and Ramayana. And this has got a lot of superstition in them. In Purana, we see a lot of superstition, heavily colored, exaggerated superstition. So Purana is considered as the most corrupt form of Hindu literature. So that is Purana. And Upavedas are also post-Vedic literatures. Upavedas are nothing but auxiliary of Vedas. So they deal with a single subject that is derived from original Veda. We shall see that. So these Upavedas would include subjects like medicine, music, architecture, eroticism, archery, and various arts and crafts. For example, we take Ayurveda. Ayurveda deals with medicine, and that is an Upaveda of Atharva Veda. It is derived from Atharva Veda. Dhanurveda deals with archery, and it is a derivative of Yajurveda. And Gandharva Veda, which deals with singing of songs, it is derivative of Samaveda. And Ardha Veda, Ardha means wealth. So Ardha Veda is a derivative of Ardha Veda, the science of Ardha or wealth, was a part of Ardha Veda, Atharva Veda, which is a main Veda. So Atharva Veda gave rise to Ardha Veda. So like that, these are auxiliary Vedas or sub-Vedas derived from the main Vedas. The next texts are Tantras. They contained the writings of some sects of Hinduism like Saka sect and Shaivite sect, and also of certain Buddhist scholars. They have the recordings or writings of some Buddhist scholars. Agamas are texts which speak specifically about sectarian Hindus. Hindus are sectarian by in this Vedic age by the society based on the god they follow. We have seen so many gods of Vedic and later Vedic period. So based on the god they follow, they are divided into various sections. So these sectarian Hindus of Vaishnavites who praise Vishnu and Shaivites, Sakas, all these sectarian kind of Hinduism is seen in Agama, a post-Vedic literature text. We see Upanga. Upanga is the collection of treatises. So treatise is something that is having a collection of books or textual knowledge regarding some special subject. So it will have all the collection, what we say, like all the songs in a single album. Like that, we have a collection about a single subject in Upanga. So all of these make up the philosophical system of Nyaya, Mimamsa, Dharma Sutras, Puranas and Tantras. So to give a confirmatory word about Smriti literature, it is nothing but it is traditionally confined to some philosophical systems like these things which we have read now. The next part is epics. So we have major epics in our post-Vedic literature. So this is also the time when Aryans and pre-Aryan culture began in India, like 800 to 550 BC. So this is coinciding with Vedic period, and also this is also coinciding with Iron Age that was started in 1000 BC. So even Aryans and pre-Aryan culture started emerging in India. So this saw a transition from Vedic civilization to later Hindu civilization. What we are right now seeing is later Hindu civilization. We are not following the Vedic civilization anymore. So this was also the time for epics of Mahabharata and Ramayana that took their fullest shapes in this period of post-Vedic period, and they belong to post-Vedic period for all of them, all the books in Mahabharata and Ramayana. Earlier they were handed down by oral tradition, but in this period they were written down in Sanskrit. So Ramayana was written down in Sanskrit, or it was known to be written by Valmiki, and Mahabharata was known to be written by Vyasa. But both of them had got some additions or accretions added to them over a course of few centuries. So what we see now, the Ramayana and Mahabharata, they are not the original texts that were written when they were in earlier versions. Ramayana is formally, it is a borderline between Itihasa and Kavya. Whereas Mahabharata is a pure Itihasa, it was a story. But Ramayana is somewhere in between. We can consider this literature as some Itihasa and some part of it is Kavya, that is poetry. The first Kavyas were based in the language of Pali. So it is certain that Mahabharata has emerged, is an earlier text, while Ramayana emerged as a later text. So both of them in any way they fall under this part of 1st century BC, because Mahabharata and Ramayana, they are edited into the present forms in the year in this period of 184 BC to 320 AD. So average we can say it was all written in 1st century BC. So Ramayana is definitely later than Mahabharata in its final form, not in the original form when it was heard and given out orally, but when it was written in Sanskrit, this came out later when compared to Mahabharata. And Mahabharata is also the longest of the world's epics. So this is some important prominent thing about our post-Vedic literature. The original Prakrit ballad elaborated into large work in Sanskrit. So it was a ballad earlier. Ballad is something that is in the form of poems or songs in short stanzas, but that would give a story finally. But it was all written into a story in Sanskrit, so that included so many extra shlokas of nearly 8,000 shlokas. So this work that is written by Vyasa, this Mahabharata work, it became a huge work and he gave out 24,000 verses of the work. So Mahabharata is a complex story which would have just a fight. So the whole of it is with a fight for a kingdom between two royal cousin sets. So the first set the name of the first set is Kurus, the second set name is Pandavas. So both of them fight for a kingdom. These belong to Hastinapur. Hastinapur is the present Uttar Pradesh state. It is in here, and Hastinapur has got its capital as Kuru in ancient history. So it seems to have started out as a smaller text. So earlier Mahabharata was called Jaya. It was a smaller text, but now with so many additions it became Mahabharata and a huge text. So that expanded with incorporation of thousands of myths. So many of mythological works are added to Mahabharata, and its full size now contains 1 lakh verses. So it was written in 24,000 verses by Vyasa, but now it grew to 1 lakh verses. And 18 parvans or sections are added to it, plus Harivamsa has also a supplement called Harivamsa. So these many things are added to Mahabharata. So all of these are accretions to Mahabharata. So we can say it has expanded many times in its original size, so much to being the result of Brahmanical accretions. So Brahmanical scripts were added to this. So Bhagavad Gita is the best known one. Bhagavad Gita is also a derivative of Mahabharata, but it has got a lot of Brahmanical additions, and this is one best example of these Brahmanical accretions to Mahabharata. The whole epic of Mahabharata is woven around a single battle that we have seen between Kurus and Pandavas. But both the Vedas and Buddhist Tripitakas, Buddhist religious texts or Tripitakas, there are 3 books. Tripitakas mean 3 books. So these 3 books, both of them don't speak the actual battle about the whole epic. They don't speak at all. But it is not mentioned in any of the Sanskrit works till the end of Brahmana period. So only the Brahmana period. So we can say that the war is a Brahmanical addition to Mahabharata. It is given only in the later sutras. So we have later sutras in post-Vedic age. So only there we see this war. There is no evidence of the epic till 200 BC. So the epic, we don't know as to what extent it is evidently visible in that place of Hastinapur. But the evidence came up in 200 BC. So it is not the work of any great scholars like Panini, Patanjali. These are Sanskrit scholars, of grammarian Sanskrit scholars and linguistic scholars. They did not develop any of this, but we are unsure of what has happened actually in Mahabharata battle. But scholars have traced several layers in the work. So there are several layers, several editions in the work. It is not an original text at all completely. The last book and the introduction of first book, they are and the 13th book. So what we see in the present form, the last one, the first book and the 13th book in Mahabharata are added in a later period of 200 to 400 BC AD. So these came up in 200 to 400 AD, but the actual books were translated into Sanskrit in around 184 BC to 320 AD. So after Mahabharata, we have Ramayana. So the Ramayana has got the story of indigenous, and it was written in Prakrit. It is all an indigenous story here in India. It was written in Prakrit in more than one version. So it was taken over by the Orthodox in the 1st and 2nd century AD and then rewritten in Sanskrit. So though it is in Prakrit, it was taken up by Valmiki and was written into Sanskrit. It has got so many slokas, and we can see the epic in all total Brahmanical character included in the epic. So this is what was not visible in the original work, but this Brahminical character is given to Ramayana in the later version that is written into Sanskrit. So the episodes were also arranged. It was not the original shape of Ramayana, but the number of books also have increased, like in case of Mahabharata, with various Brahminical influences or Brahminical accretions and editions. So the Rama's search for Sita and triumphant crusade of Aryan civilization. So how Aryans triumphed, or they won over this search of Sita and the war, everything. It all portrayed Ravana, a character, as monster, and all of this portrayed or revered or it praised Aryan civilization, and then the triumphant crusade for Sita, and then their victory for finding her. So all of this reiterated on Aryan civilization. So that's what we must come to know. As a whole, it has got 7 books, and the last book and parts of the first book are added later, so they are interpolated versions. So in these 2 books, Rama is spoken as divine character, and he is incarnation of God Vishnu. We see God Vishnu, he is a god created in later Vedic period, and Rama is known to be incarnated to this god. And although in the original books 2 to 6 he is said to be a mortal hero, from 2 to 6 he is called a mortal hero, but in the first and 7th book he is called suddenly a god. So this says that Ramayana is also written in with some accretions and additions of later Brahmins' influence. The average date of this composition seems to be 1st century BC, same as Mahabharata, but this is a later work than Mahabharata, and acquired its final shape in 250 AD. So we can say post-Vedic literature extended even to 250 AD, and while coming to Smritis, it has extended to 900 AD also, because the second part of Dharma Shastras were written in 900 AD. So thus the Ramayana, as also the Mahabharata, because of the role of Krishna, and the Bhagavad Gita, divine song, the meaning of it is divine song, derivative of Mahabharata, or regarded not only as the mother of all tales of India. So the mother of all tales of India are these 3 books, but they are also revered with sacredness, and they are considered as sacred scriptures of India. So we see the role of Krishna in Mahabharata, and he gives out a divine song, that is what is called Bhagavad Gita. So because of this belief of Krishna being a god, they consider it as sacred scriptures in India. So the Mahabharata, the main wandering of the exiled Pandavas, and we see this fight between Pandavas and Kurus. So they are restricted to the geographical area of Doyab. The Doyab is the area between Ganga and Yamuna, so we call it Ganga Yamuna Doyab. While the geographical area in Ramayana where Lord Rama lived, we see the central and southern India's influence. So Lord Rama's capital is Ayodhya, we say that his extension is far-reaching than Mahabharata, because Ayodhya is in Uttar Pradesh, but we also see central India and southern India in Ramayana. So this is the geographical area of Mahabharata and Ramayana. Uttarapatha. So Ayodhya is it is present in Uttarapatha, which is now Uttar Pradesh, and it is also 500 kilometers east to Kuru or Pandavas Hastinapur. Kuru is the capital of Hastinapur. If Mahabharata hints at the pattern of settlement in north and west, so Ramayana hints about southern part or eastern part, and he comes to central part and southern part until Sri Lanka. He goes there also. So all of these geographical areas of present India and peninsular India and its areas around, we see in Ramayana and Mahabharata also. Ramayana provides previous evidence of continuing spread of Aryanization. So Aryans are given victory in finding out Sita. So we see their triumphing situations and scenes. So we see Aryanization in Ramayana in first millennium BC. So in 1000 BC. The Mahabharata is essentially retrospective. It is earlier to Ramayana. So prior to first million BC, we see these retrospective earlier things in Mahabharata. It celebrates a vanishing past and may be read as a swan song. Swan song is the final song of an old order. That means it ended the old order, like clan kinship and martial ethics associated with it, and slowly they all ended in Mahabharata. Ramayana may be seen as an epic legitimizing the monarchical state. We see King Rama in this, so monarchical state is legitimized in Ramayana. By way of contrast, Ramayana may be considered as decidedly forward-looking, whereas Mahabharata we see it as retrospective, but this is forward-looking. So he regains his capital and he indulge in remorse or even to reaffirm Vedic values. So Rama does so many of these things. So he is regarded as a dazzling utopia. So his rule is regarded as a dazzling utopia of order, justice, and prosperity. Under his personal rule, this dazzling utopia was playing. Utopia is just an imagination of perfection. So his kingdom was imagined to be perfect. So that is what the present Hindu world takes so deeply about Rama. That is the Rama Rajya or Rama Raj in Hindi, the rule of Rama. It became very popular and it is still in the ideals of Indian politics. Ayodhya itself came to represent the model of royal capital. So while Ayodhya is regarded as a model for royal capital, Rama is regarded as model for royal king. So as such would feature in many subsequent Aryanized state systems. So in several Aryanized state systems, we see the influence of Ramarajya and his rule. In this guise, it would travel far. For instance, so many Asian countries are associated with the same Ramayana. Like in Thailand, the same story is taken up. Like Ayodhya is compared to Ayutthaya. It is called with the name Ayutthaya. Bangkok, as we know, it is the capital of Thailand. Prior to Bangkok, they used to have this capital of Ayutthaya in their epics. So that is how this Ramayana is also felt in some Asian countries like Thailand. So this is by Thai monarchs. Supposedly, it is something replicated as Rama's city. And even in central Java, the Javanese people also revered this. So they call it it is still that of Jogjakarta, or with this name they call the city, and they attribute it with the perfection of Ayodhya that we see in Ramayana. So the first part of which is a Javanese rendering to Ayodhya. So Jogjakarta, they call it, they revere it as Ayodhya. So we see the impact of Ramayana even in other Asian nations, not just in India. Thus, Ayodhya score higher than Hastinapur or Indraprastha. Ayodhya is in Ramayana and Hastinapur or Indraprastha we see in Mahabharata. So they score higher marks compared to Hastinapur or Mahabharata places in terms of this Indian, that political ideal of Rama, that Rama Raja, and in such positive things of justice, order, prosperity, and all. Whereas Mahabharata, it survives in the popular imagination as a horde of cherished but disjointed segments. So, but Ramayana is still alive, but Mahabharata is considered with some disjointed segments. So, in 1990s, even the sanctity of Ayodhya, which we see in Ramayana, is also questioned, and it became an issue. So that is because there were some shootings by the police on civilians after Ram Rath Yatra that happened during October, on October 30, especially on November 2nd. These firings happened. So that was news about Ayodhya, and its sanctity grew ever since then. Their importance for religious history apart, the epics can be seen as simply fiction and mythology. But basically, to conclude up, these epics are based on fiction and mythology, and there is no reality on that. But some scholars have tried to excavate the sites like Ayodhya, Hastinapur, but they could not find anything so far. So we can interpret these recordings, the establishment in history, for political practices. We can use them for political practices because of the ideals followed by that king of Rama, king of Ayodhya, and all. For example, these things of primogeniture, that is, the eldest son must be given the throne. They are all seen and they are all re-established in these texts of Ramayana and Mahabharata. That's what we can learn from them. The epics are also perfect examples of didactic texts. So these didactic texts will speak about social values, cultural values, and some good things like devotion towards parents, giving respect to brothers, elder brothers, and loyalty to one's husband. So all of these good things and morals are there in these texts, so for which we must revere them. Ramayana lays down models for ideal behavior of men, women in various ways, like Maryada Purushottam Rama. He is regarded for his behavior as Maryada Purushottam Rama, and chaste Sita. Chaste Sita is some good charactered Sita. So all these things can be taken up by Indian society from these epics of Mahabharata and Ramayana. Of course, they are based on some myth and fiction, which they have powerful influence on shaping Indian social practices. So various versions of Ramayana were composed after Valmiki's text in other languages like Prakrit, Tamil, and so many other duplications were also done to the original. The Mahabharata closely questions the question of dharma and what is righteous behavior and what is not. So this is what Mahabharata deals with. And Bhagavad Gita, which is a part of Mahabharata, it is not only a Vaishnava scripture, it is not just a religious scripture, but it has got some philosophical documents that would guide some actions of individuals in the time of problems, crisis, and self-doubt. So that is some encouraging thing to a personal problems of individual, but not just a religious scripture belonging to Vaishnava sect. So this is something about Ramayana and Mahabharata, two epics of post-Vedic literature. Now we shall see nature in ancient texts of post-Vedic literature. These ancient texts, they could be religious or non-religious texts, but they portray some relation between human beings and nature. So the basic point in nature in ancient texts is nature in India. So nature is revered the most in Indian ancient literature. We shall see how nature is regarded and revered in various ancient texts of India. So nature included forest and tree, and these things were worshipped also. Now we shall see the reverence given to nature in Brahmanical texts. So Brahmanical texts, we see these are one of the earliest forms of texts in which nature was worshipped. So we see this in Vedic literature, like in Rig Veda, natural elements were worshipped, like air, water, earth, sun, rain, wind, storm, dawn. So all these natural elements are worshipped. For example, Varuna god is revered for rain. So like that, these personification of natural things was done in Rig Veda and Vedas. So the natural attributes, they attributed them to deities, and they also gave good colors like green color, symbolizing greenery and nature, to some gods like Soma, and brightness of fire to some god like Agni, and swiftness of wind to Vayu. So they gave these colors of nature to these gods. So this shows that how Vedic people and post-Vedic people were so much intricately related to nature and how they respected nature. These beliefs helped in the preservation of environment. So India is known to be preserving environment since its ancient time, as ancient texts say. Vedic literature consists of threefold division. So this threefold division of universe is seen in Vedic literature, like Prithvi, Antariksha, Jayu. So the meaning of Prithvi is simply earth. So whatever we see in the observed space, for whatever we see as an observer around us, where we live and die, is all Prithvi. Antariksha is something which is an aerial space which is between heaven and earth. Jayu is completely heaven beyond Antariksha, and that is regarded as light space. So these three things, this is how universe is divided in Vedic literature, and this is some evidence that nature is revered even in ancient Indian history. Some other ancient texts that speak about nature are Ardha Veda. So Atharva Veda, in Atharva Veda, we have the existence of three coverings around our surrounding. So these are known as Chandamsi. So Chandamsi would include water, air, plant or herb, simply the things which surround us. So this is in Atharva Veda. The earth is called Visvambara. So they gave respect to earth as a woman. Visvambara is a female person, and they represented it that it is giving us good support, and the universe is supported by herbs, oceans, mountains, hills and all. So they gave this female status to earth. And according to beliefs in Upanishads, even Upanishads revere universe. That Upanishads contain that universe contains 5 elements of earth or land is one element, water, light or luster. Luster is small, beautiful light is called luster. So light, dim light, luster, air and ether. Ether is not this chemical either, but air which is seen in space, which we don't breathe, which is in outer space. So all of these make up the universe. That is what Upanishads speak. So nature has maintained a balance between these constituents of all we have seen right now, or elements, and our living creatures. So we living beings with our nature, with these things of air, land, water, light, things like that, we maintain a balance. If any disturbance comes, it would impact us or our life on this earth. So this is what ancient texts, post-Vedic texts speak. To speak about something on trees, plants and herbs in post-Vedic literature, so knowledge about significance of plants and herbs has always been an asset of India. These are also called Aushadhi. Aushadhi simply means, in Rig Veda it refers to plants, and it is regarded as a mother figure. So there we can also trace them in Vedic literature. The Aranyani Sukta. Aranyani Sukta is in Rig Veda. Aranya means forest. It addresses Aranyani, it is the deity or queen of the forest. So it is praised like that. And Aushadha, we have seen it is some plants thing and some medicine out of plants. And even Chandogya Upanishad, it has high regard for plants as generator of food. So plant gives us food. So that is what is written in Chandogya Upanishad. The Atharva Veda also mentions some Aushadhis, their uses, their values, which is an important source for Ayurveda. So Ayurveda, we saw it is an Upaveda of Atharva Veda. So this Upaveda contains some knowledge about Aushadhis and all. So by this we come to know that the trees, plants and herbs are given a lot of importance, and there is a lot of textual thing about them in ancient texts of Indian history. Even the Vedic hymns also instruct that forests should not be destroyed. There are some songs that speak against the destruction of forests in ancient Vedic literature. According to a section of Purana called Padma Purana, one tree is equal to 10 suns. So this is the importance given to a tree. In Atharva Veda, there is a word called Avi. Avi means greenness. So it means greenness is regarded as protector of our living nature, of our world and earth. So Avi is given a lot of importance in Atharva Veda. Even Mahabharata and Ramayana, they speak about forest lands, and they speak about various regions in India where flora and fauna are spread. As we see in Ramayana, we see this movement of Rama in search of Sita. So on the way, there is a lot of geography written over the Indian forest lands. Even in Sangam epic, Sangam period is from 6th century BC to 3rd century AD. So even in Sangam period, there are two big literary works of Sangam period like Silapadikaram and Manimekalai. Even they speak about land, flora and inhabitants of Tamil region and land and flora over there. And Sangam literature has got fivefold ecological classification. So we see ecological classification in modern ecology, but even this Sangam period in BC itself, India has got some ecological classification. Of the Tamil, namely the hills. Hills are regarded as Kurinji. Tamil in Sangam literature is called as Tinai. And dry lands are called Palai. The jungle or forests or woodlands are called Mullai. Cultivated plants or agricultural lands are called Marudam. Coastal areas which are on sea coast are called Neidal. So in this way, they have fivefold ecological classification written in Sangam epics. These zones are inhabited by people, and these people have different occupations based on the area they are living in. If they are in agricultural land, they are farmers. If they are in jungle and woodland, they are gatherers. So like that, these occupations are linked with fivefold ecological classification in Sangam epics. So in this way, these ancient Indian literary texts speak a lot about ecology and forest, nature, environment, things like that. Coming to Buddhist texts, they also speak about conservation practices like protecting plants. And they also speak about sacred groves. Sacred groves or forests or single tree. This can be a single tree or a huge forest that is revered for some deity, for some goddess, and must be protected by a certain community who believes in that goddess. So these sacred groves and ponds must be protected. One Buddhist text called Lalita Vistara, it attaches Sala tree with divine birth of Buddha. So Buddha was born near Sala tree. Sala tree is nothing but sal tree, which is called Shoria robusta. So this sal tree is attached to Buddha's birth. So it is given importance. So he was born in a sacred grove full of Sala trees. So these are dedicated to goddess Lumbini. Lumbini is an important major goddess in Buddhist texts, and there is also a place called Lumbini for Buddhist pilgrimage site in Nepal. Buddha also attained enlightenment, and this is also attributed to a tree called Peepal tree. It is nothing but fig tree or Ficus religiosa. So that is called Bodhi tree. Buddhist literature refers to other trees like Plaksa, that is Ficus infectoria. Gunja is also called a pea. It is a pea, rosary pea. So it would have some seeds like this with red and black color. So it is called Gunja. The scientific name of it is Abrus pectorius. So this is what is Gunja. So these kind of various trees are also read about in ancient Buddhist texts in ancient Indian history. Coming to Jaina texts, Jaina religious texts like Agamas are there. They also contain some notions of environmental protection. They have 5 main elements of nature like Prithvi, land, soil, etc. Jal, which speaks about water, Agni, fire, Vayu, air, Vanaspati, vegetation. So these 5 main elements we see in Jain texts. And they also give importance to living creatures. and they have a concept of not harming any creature, so they don't harm any creature in order to protect environment. Even Lord Mahavira in Jain, he is the founder of Jainism, and he also got enlightenment under a sala tree on the banks of river Rijuvalika. Rijuvalika river is in Jharkhand, so this is how they also give importance to trees. So even Jain ascetics, these Jain sadhus, they go and live in forests and they get enlightenment under trees. So trees and nature are given a lot of importance even in Jain texts. In one of the Jain texts like Acharanga Sutra, this Lord Mahavira warns against contamination of natural resources. So what we see right now, Mahavira warned at an earlier stage itself. So he warns about contamination of natural resources, and this would lead to exploitation of resources, and we won't have anything to consume. So we need to be not consumeristic. We must not eat so much than what is required. This is what he emphasizes. He emphasizes on utility than consumption. Utility is upayoga, consumption is upabhoga. Consumption is taking what is more than what we need, and utility is using it in a sustainable manner. So this is what Mahavira observes. Some of the other non-religious texts are there, not like Buddhist, Jainist texts like that, but non-religious literature which speaks about nature, or Kautilya Shabda Shastra. He speaks about putting up forest sanctuaries, what we now call as biosphere reserves, sanctuaries, animal reserves, national parks. So he spoke of them very early in ancient periods only. So according to this Kautilya, he says that king should establish an animal park. So beyond his hunting ground for recreation, a king would have this for recreation. Beyond that, he must set up an animal park to protect animals. And he also says that kings must maintain a forest for elephants that must be guarded. And he says that if anyone kills an elephant, he must be killed. So he says that these animal sanctuaries must be called Abhayaranyas or Abhaya Vana. So this is what we call national parks and biosphere reserves in modern day world. So meaning forest free from fear. So the forest and its animals must be free from fear in Abhayaranyas or Abhayavanas according to Kautilya Ardhashastra. So the Ardhashastras further speaks about highest fine imposition while killing or binding or injuring a deer, beast, bird or fish, and 50 panas is the fine that must be paid back if any calf, bull or a milch cow is killed. So milch cow or cows that are kept back for milking. So likewise, this text records fines for cutting, hurting forests, and 6 panas is the fine for cutting down the forests that bear flowers and fruits and that give shelter. So this is what Kautilya and Ardhashastra observes about importance of nature and how that must be protected. So in inhabited areas, any trees or plant, if it grows, it must be protected, and fines must be imposed for hunting down trees. And penance grows in cremation grounds. In cremation grounds, the trees must be protected, and in penance grows is where one goes. This is also a religious site where one goes and confesses for his sins. So in those areas also hurting trees is a wrong thing. And some of Kalidasa's work that speak about environmental harmony or Meghadutam, Raghuvamsam, Abhignana Sekuntala. So these are some works of Kalidasa that speaks about importance of forests, rivers, mountains and all. Even he describes about seasons and seasonal changes in his work. So Kalidasa, Kautilya, they are non-religious literary workers for nature. Even Shakuntala is a woman. She is a very famous female protagonist character in Shakuntala drama of Kalidasa. So she also speaks about nature and protecting and living with harmony with nature. And the last person we are seeing in non-religious literature that speaks about nature is Banabhatta. Banabhatta wrote 2 texts like Harshacharitam and Kadambari. In these 2 texts, he speaks about how to protect nature, and in Harshacharitam especially he speaks about Vindhya region of Madhya Pradesh, and pure landscape and natural bounties in Vindhya region are all described in Harshacharitam. And he also wrote Kadambari, in which he speaks about variety of birds, parrots and other animals in Vindhya forest. So all of Vindhya, beauty of Vindhya forest and nature in Vindhya forest is written by Banabhatta in Harshacharitam and Kadambari. So these are some non-religious writers about nature in Indian literature. So in this video we have seen post-Vedic literature, that is Smriti literature, under which we read Vedanga, Shat Darshana, Itihasas. Under Itihasas, we have seen epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, and some post-Vedic literature about nature in India in ancient texts. And nature in ancient texts included nature in Brahmanical texts, nature in Buddhist texts, nature in Jaina texts, and nature in non-religious texts by Kautilya Ardhashastra, Kalidasa's works like Raghuvamsam, Abhignana Shakuntalam, Shakuntala Meghadutam, and nature by Banabhatta's texts like Harshacharitam and Kadambari. So this is about post-Vedic period, and thank you.